Crude Audacity podcast.
Everyone, you are listening to the Crude Audacity podcast, the podcast that talks shop shit and all things strategy with oil patch influencers. I am Catherine Mills, and before we begin today, wherever you are listening from, go ahead and leave us a rate and review. And if you happen to be tuned in on YouTube, go ahead and click that little subscribe button for me. That way you can stay up to date on all things oil, energy, and of course the Crude Audacity. So, for today's topic, ladies and gentlemen, it occurred to me that the energy industry, the oil and gas industry, is in a period of creative destruction. Many might not understand from that term. Creative destruction is the process by which an industry revolutionizes from the inside out due to one external measure or another. COVID, Saudi versus Russia, transitional energy, alternative energy. We are being hit constantly, and now is the opportunity to pivot. And as you know, on the last few episodes, I have been calling for a maverick, a thought leader, someone who is an innovator, thinking outside the box. And industry should let leadership start rising through the ranks because we need new ideas. No longer can your pitch include a restructure of an LOS, or let's say you're chasing behind pipe, because that's no longer an idea, that's a copy. So as if the heavens have opened, I have found an oil field team who is navigating this pivot like a champ, rising through the ashes and redefining the energy industry. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I sit down with JOHANNA of Transitional Energy, and we are going to talk geothermal. JOHANNA, welcome to the Crude Audacity.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Thank you so much. I am so excited for this conversation. You know, in my intro, I know I kind of told you, but I am just looking for someone who's doing something different, and your team is doing something different. I mean, I hope everyone listens to this episode and is galvanized and has ideas and starts thinking about the basics and how to change this industry and continue this creative destruction. So before we go into everything that you guys are doing, tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you get into oil and energy? How are you in the ranks that you are now? And what has been your experience?
Yeah, thanks for that intro. So my history, I went to school at Montana Tech. That's a pretty common oil and gas school. I actually got a geological engineering degree right out of college. And one of my first internships was at a mine, a gold mine in Nevada. And I was like, God, I love geology. I love the engineering side. And I was excited about mining, and then I had an opportunity to have an internship with Noble Energy my last summer, and I was like, you know what's even cooler than mining gold is getting oil and gas out of the ground. They gave me an offer right out of school, and I started with them as a geologist, actually. I think they only read the first part of my degree. So I worked as a geologist for them for a couple years in their rotational program. And then, as you might know, working in the oil field, right, geologists and engineers approach problems differently and kind of see the world differently. And we need both in the oil and gas industry, but my brain was definitely more of the engineering side. I worked with some old exploration geologists, and they could think in 4D in space all at the same time to do exploration geology, which I was like, that is awesome, but that is not how my brain works. So switched into engineering, and I did a variety of different types, production engineering, completion engineering there, worked on some projects in Texas and Oklahoma, and then really spent probably the bulk of my time there working the DJ Basin. So I was there when, the first horizontal wells were first drilled in the DJ Basin outside of Denver. So that was exciting. We were like, what are these horizontal wells that people are drilling? Maybe we should try that. So worked on the Gemini horizontal that we drilled at Noble, which was exciting, kind of kicked off a lot of the horizontal development kind of in the middle of the DJ. So that was fun. And then about 2014, right before the oil price tanked, I got a job opportunity to work for SM Energy out of Billings, Montana. So it was an opportunity to get closer to home, have in-laws around the kids. So that was nice. Worked the Bakken as a reservoir and reserves engineer for a couple years. Okay. And then 2017, they closed that office, and about half of us moved back to Denver. And then when I got back to Denver, I was like, who do I really want to work for? What would be something exciting and new for me to try? And so that's why I had the opportunity to work at Extraction Oil and Gas through some of the network I had built up at Noble. And that was a fun company. I just started there right after they had their IPO, just a few months after. So it's very much like a startup feel when we first got there. And Extraction Oil and Gas, any kind of DJ basin operator knows they have really great acreage, but it's right underneath people's homes. So it was an interesting time there. I worked as an asset development engineer there for a couple years, and then transitioned into the regulatory manager role, kind of my last role there, which was interesting because that was right after SB 181 had passed, and there was all the local rulemaking. And as a urban operator, we were always asked to come in and kind of provide feedback on rules, whether they listened to us or not was one thing. But so that was fun. We had a lot of city council meetings where, people just loved us there. Actually, most of the time they really didn't. But so it was a good opportunity to, really understand rulemaking and how that works. And got some exposure to multiple different municipalities and counties there. So they, filed for bankruptcy a few months ago. So I'm no longer in action, but thankfully through my network, I knew some folks that had started up a company that was looking at, taking waste streams from oil and gas wells and figuring out how to turn those into profit streams. So I had an old friend that I had worked with at Noble, and we had talked about, starting a geothermal energy company utilizing existing oil and gas well bores, because what that's, produces a lot of hot water. And so how can you monetize that and create electricity from it? So yeah, I had the opportunity to jump on board this startup, and 2020 has been a ride for us all.
Well, that is awesome. So before we go into all these questions I have, because I'm fascinated by this, let's talk about transitional energy, because as you and I were discussing earlier, transitional energy could be a great thing to, let's say, an activist group who wants to take down oil and energy, or it could be a very scary thing to oil field workers who think that their jobs are being compromised. Or heck, even just engineers, it could be green masking. It's got the word transitional has a lot of emotion behind it. And I'm not sure if you watched the recent debate between Biden and Trump, but I was very focused on their energy policy, and they both suck. They don't even know what's going on. So yeah. When you talk about transitional energy, your time in the oil field, what did you notice? What was the sort of buzz around the word transitional?
Yeah, and how we approach the word transitional at our company is there's a new energy space that we're trying to develop, which is using existing oil and gas wells that are producing hydrocarbons and water and transitioning them into renewable geothermal power producers. So it's this transitional space between fossil fuels, all the bad things that, green investors or ESG investors don't want to hear anything about, and transitioning them into geothermal renewable power producers so that all these, aggressive renewable energy goals can be met. But we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We can still use existing oil and gas wells to reach these goals. And, some hydrocarbons may or may not be produced, but that's not the goal. The goal is to produce, hot water for renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. So from the public's perspective, do you see transitional energy as just a fight that we can never win, even with something as innovative as this, where we are connecting the two sources? Because historically, oil and transitional energy, alternative energy, has always been interconnected, and people don't want to recognize that. They don't want to talk about impact, but you're positioning here with transitional energy, which is literally a bridge there, still working on that relationship. So kind of what are your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I think it's time for the oil and gas industry to think that, the old way of doing things, how oil and gas has been produced over the years, we need to think about the future and kind of where things are going politically and socially in the world. And while we're never going to get away from hydrocarbons, we need them for everything we do. We also need to think about how we can have less impact on the environment, and how we can use existing resources and energy sources that are abundant, just as abundant as oil and gas, and how can we produce electricity that maybe has less of a environmental footprint.
I love that. So geothermal, people almost forget about it sometimes, but it's so neat. You hear about wind and solar and these big wind farms, and people are putting those in, but there have been a lot of advancements in the geothermal space. So where do you see the future of this portion of the spectrum going? Because they all sort of, they grow on each other over time.
Yeah, totally. I was just looking up some statistics actually before we met, and I found this. The DOE puts out a report every year, and they said that the thermal resource in the Earth's surface contains 50,000 times more energy than all the oil and gas resources in the world. Really? So geothermal energy, there's a lot of heat in the Earth, and we produce it through a various means, but one of which is oil and gas wells. And if there's any way that we can somehow turn that thermal heat or thermal energy into electricity, we're just throwing away a resource that's produced all the time. So it makes sense to try and make clean electricity that's truly baseload. So the issue with wind and solar is that, it only works when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. Whereas oil and gas wells, we all know they have like 95% uptime if you're doing your business right? So, and you can scale it. You can turn your pump on so you can produce more, or slow your pump down, which can mirror, what the electrical grid needs for power generation. So geothermal has been pretty much ignored up till now as a major energy source because it's been pretty high risk and pretty expensive. And a lot of that has to do, any exploration geologist that works offshore they'll tell you, like, if you get one well out of 3 that's successful, then you're a gigantic success, right? You're going to win Wildcatter of the Year. And the same is sort of true for geothermal, right? You have to explore for these super hot water. And plus, when you're drilling super hot or super deep, the technology just hasn't been there to do that until recently. And then, traditional geothermal has used the steam of the water itself to turn the turbine to create electricity. Well, in the past, 10 years, organic Rankine cycle engines or binary cycle engines have really improved their efficiency. So you're able to use much cooler temperature water to create more electrons than you were in the past. So geothermal technology has really improved. And I think of it a lot like the oil and gas industry, We started drilling horizontal wells. We weren't very good at it. We couldn't stay in zone. Yeah, we didn't know how to frack. There's crazy stories about what people would throw down hole, including like nuclear, right? They do crazy things with fracks. Yeah. So much like geothermal, there hasn't been a lot of time and money spent on making the technology get better. But in the past, 5 or 10 years, it really has improved. And there's a lot of new companies coming out that are trying all sorts of different things, enhanced geothermal systems. They're using the heat of the earth like a radiator. So there's some really cool technology that's occurring right now in the geothermal space.
I actually heard that one of the more innovative parts of geothermal was the idea of utilizing horizontal wells, not oil wells, just, their normal wellbore size, which is nothing compared to what you see out in the oil field. But it was apparently a very revolutionary conversation at one point, because they were like, well, no, we go vertical. It's super easy. And I love it. I love how well it's connecting here. What you said was very interesting, though, about baseload. So that's always been my argument with alternatives. It's not that there's no place for them. It's not that the oil industry is fighting them. It's that they don't support baseload. So geothermal does?
Yeah, so that's one of the really neat selling points about geothermal is it's much like a natural gas powered plant or nuclear, right? It's on all the time. But what's nice about it is that it's renewable and it doesn't have a waste stream. So we're just producing hot water and injecting it back in. And that turns a binary cycle engine that has a working fluid that's just a closed loop system. So there's basically no emissions. And it's on all the time, right? So like I said just before, it's base load, it's on all the time. So it's a nice complement to wind and solar, which, we're not getting away from wind and solar. Wind and solar has a great place in the energy mix. But as we saw in California just recently with the brownouts, and Governor Gavin Newsom was very upset, sent a letter to all the power producers and was like, come on, guys, what are you doing? You're not giving us consistent power. And then, and I thought, the Geothermal Resource Council sent him a letter back and said that, all of our geothermal power plants were running at 100% uptime during this, during the brownouts. So really just shifting the grid to more baseload power would just be good for everyone. Another example is a lot of, we've had fires and smoke. Yes. We've been dealing with it. California obviously has been dealing with it, the Pacific Northwest. And all that ash that's been falling in the air is covering up all the solar panels. And so there are just inherent problems with wind and solar, and not that they can't be fixed or alleviated, but you need a complement, which is a baseload power source.
I kind of love it. It's triggering the reduce, reuse, recycle that we learned as kids. And our parents thought we were absolutely insane. And then it became very mainstream, very normal. It started in school and moved its way up. And in this particular case, I'll let you get into all the details because it's just so flippin' cool. But we have an existing source of energy. Let's call them some stripper wells. So, they dance around a little bit. You're reducing you're utilizing a waste stream, and then you're keeping it consecutively going, which is just recycling it. That's brilliant. So can you please go into some epic detail about how you guys are turning waste streams into cash flow options?
Yeah. So like you said, there's a lot of stripper wells, right? I think as all the old vertical wells are aging and operators are like, they're reaching to the point where the wells just aren't economic to run anymore. The OPEX costs are just too high. And now they've got just so many wells they're P&Ing every year. That's a big problem. And it's a liability for a lot of states also. So the state of Colorado has an orphan well list that's quite extensive. And so what we're trying to say is, hey, all this capital that people sunk into the ground, it doesn't need to be just plugged and abandoned and left, or maybe for a house to be built on it 50 years from now or something. Why don't we use the existing heat resource that is in the ground and, like I said, create baseload power for it? So, the other side of it is it's not just oil and gas going, well, there's things that can be done in the geothermal space, and I know how to produce hot fluids. I've been doing that my whole career. Mm-hmm. The other piece that we've really come to understand that's pivotal about this business model is understanding the power markets, right? So not everywhere is the power market conducive to getting the kind of power purchase agreement rates or the power rates that you need. So though there are oil and gas wells spread across, a lot of the United States and other countries, not everywhere makes sense to make renewable energy, or you're going to get the rates that you need. So it's being close to load centers, and it's understanding where there are aggressive renewable energy goals that the consumer needs a solution for these goals that they've set, and wind and solar and battery just aren't going to get them there. So it's kind of a convergence of not just oil and gas knowledge, but understanding power marketing that we found is really key to kind of transition oil and gas well bores.
So not every producing formation is going to qualify for this. You really need, what kind of water cut do y'all typically seek? Really? Yeah.
So if you think back in the conventional oil and gas well days, those are the kind of wells we need. So like sandstones that produce a lot of water. We need lots of porosity and permeability to produce a lot of flow. Mm-hmm. So you need basically a minimum temperature of 150 degrees up to 250 degrees for these organic Rankine cycle engines. And then you need, upwards of 5,000 barrels of water per day produced. Okay. Oil will work too, but it doesn't, it's not as conductive for heat as water is. So, 100% water cut is the best we can get. And you need a hefty flow rate. So you need consistently upwards of 5,000 barrels of water per day. So think of like the old water floods that we may or may not have worked on in the first of our career, right? It's those kind of wells that we're looking at. You can, of course, put them on, new horizontally fracked wells that are producing a ton of fluid, but there's such a decline rate in those wells, as we all know, that you won't have consistent energy production. So we're looking at like wells that you don't need to frack, basically. So if you have to frack the well, that means it probably won't work.
Interesting. So it's it's an interesting perspective from an investment side. Are you talking to oil investors? Or are you talking to geothermal investors? Because although we are fully on the energy spectrum, it's amazing how little they talk. We're integrated, but we don't really talk about innovation ideas together. So how are those conversations going?
Yeah, it's a transitional space, right? That's what we keep focusing on. And so for better or worse, it's finding the right investor that wants to think about the energy transition. So we've kind of, we'll talk to anybody. So we've talked to venture capital firms. We kind of started there, green tech or climate tech investors. And what we kind of found out pretty early on is they're like, well, where's your patent? And we're like, well, this is not a patentable thing. It's a process. I'm taking existing technology and applying it to the oil and gas space. And so, typical VC firms want to invest in a new widget, or a new software program or something, and they want to see something that's going to have a 10x return in 2 years. Well, so we're a resource power producing company. We're like a wind farm or a solar farm. That's not going to get you a 10x return. However, it's going to get you steady rates of return for 20 to 40 years. So it's just a different type of investment model. Okay. So we talked to plenty of venture capital firms. They're always like, that's a really cool idea, but we don't really invest in that sort of thing. So we've also talked to private equity, and those have been pretty good conversations. And we're still ongoing. We're about a third of the way funded in our seed round. We've had success with angel investors, and really, where we find is most important is that if you have somebody that understands oil and gas or has some sort of background in oil and gas, they instantly get it. Whereas explaining to someone who's doesn't understand oil and gas at all, they just think it's risky. They don't understand. For better or for worse, oil and gas is difficult to understand for some people, so it helps to have an investor that's already sort of aware of it. And then you can tell your story much more effectively. But we'll talk to anybody.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. So you're still producing hydrocarbons if the well will give them. So you basically end up with two revenue streams, one way or the other. And that's pretty interesting, correct? You're not shutting off the oil. You're not parsing it out in some weird way.
Yeah, no, that's another thing where we've been talking to ESG investors, and they're kind of like, they're specifically focused on renewable energy investments. They want to help, climate change. They have these strong goals, and we're like, yes, but also we will be producing a little bit of hydrocarbons. And they're like, well, then I don't know, so there's some investors that don't want anything to do with fossil fuels. So we've run up against that a couple of times, but yes, there will be revenue from two different sources, probably, less and less as oil is eventually flushed out of the way, or there isn't any left in the wells. So honestly, we've been kind of running it as a way to handle OPEX costs. It's a nice revenue stream, but obviously not something we're focused on. We're looking at wells, indistinguishably. If there's oil revenue, great. If not, we're a power producing company. That's what we're focused on. Okay.
That's pretty cool. So from the ESG, talk to us about, because this is an ever evolving topic as well, especially from the investment side. It came from the investment side, really. The money dictated it. We needed to check several boxes, but there's no official scorecard. People put out their ESG ratings, but who the heck actually knows what that means right now? So can you explain to us, just at the basic levels, how this is helping the ESG initiative? People need to stop focusing on the oil that's produced. How is this really making it a full circle smart, earth-friendly investment?
Yeah, I think there's a certain subset of investors that really want to put their money towards good, and they think good is, ESG, environmental social governance. They want to do something with their money that they think is going to help the climate or help people, and I'm fully supportive of that. So what we're trying to say is, we are recycling, reusing oil and gas technology, personnel and resources and capital that was spent in oil and gas. And we want to transition those existing assets into renewable energy producers. So I don't, I use the term throw the baby out with the bathwater, but it's true. You need to think about where the world is today. And if there are ways to utilize existing technology or existing well bores that were drilled by oil and gas companies, why not take those and do some good with it? Good in terms for an ESG investor.
Just keep it going. Why not? You already have the infrastructure in place. So
exactly.
On surface, actually, that leads to a really good question. How much change is happening? Because when I've seen geothermal facilities, they look extensive. So how is that changing? Are you scrapping old oil field surface relics, or are you able to reuse them? How is the operations changing up there?
Yeah, so the basics of oil and gas production is still the same, right? You have 3-phase or maybe 2-phase flow coming out of the well bore. And before it hits the separator, we are attaching these modular geothermal power units. Okay. So you can buy these off the shelf from multiple different vendors. There's some in the United States, but mainly in Europe. So this is a very common technology used in Europe. It's thermal heat or thermal heat waste, and they just convert that to electricity. They're actually, quite a bit ahead of the United States in terms of, renewable energy investment and goals. So you take these modular geothermal power units and you can put them in series. They're about the size of a large refrigerator up to the size of a shipping container. Mm-hmm. Kind of depends on what sort of megawatts you're going to produce from each one. So you just pipe the fluids coming out of the wellbore through these and you put them in series. And so it depends on the temperature of your water, how many you put in series. There's we calculate a 10-degree drop between each unit. So till it drops to about 150, then you can't really make much electricity out of it. And then it goes into the separator. You separate out the oil, gas, water, and then the water will take it to a lake, through a water treatment plant, which is really basically filtration, because we're just going to inject it again into the same formation. So it's much like, an old water flood. I mentioned that before, but it's very similar technology, except right before it goes to the separator, we're going to take the thermal heat off of it and spin some turbines and create electricity. It's a pretty simple idea. Of course, the execution is not always as simple, but it's good that I can explain it simply. So that's good.
No, I love it. So let's switch to the business acumen side of that, because that is fascinating. But you also decided to start this, end of 2019, really jumping on 2020 officially, and the world went to hell. So for all of those oil field entrepreneurs, how's it going? In terms of finding your team.
So we thought, March would be a great time to get started on fundraising. We attended the NREL's National Renewable Energy Laboratories Investor Forum, and that was at the end of April. And that was, March was about where we all started to hunker down at home. And so we had our first virtual investor forum at the end of April, which, it's like commonplace now. Everything's online and we have Zoom calls and we do that. But it's a bit weird asking or talking about your company and trying to build a relationship with someone when they're on your laptop, right? You miss the human touch, being able to shake someone's hand. So that's been interesting. But summer was a bit slow, but things are picking up. It's interesting that a lot of people, though, they weren't, traveling was a little bit weird this year, but a lot of rich people were still traveling this summer. So it was hard to pin down people to talk to, but things have really picked up. It's just, it was interesting. As you know, with Zoom calls, you see what a person's home looks like, right?
And so you'll head syndrome.
So you'll talk to these venture capital guys out of Boston. And for instance, we had this one call where every call we were on, he had his towel hanging on on his closet. So just like weird things that you pick up, are like, you're going to give me millions of dollars. Yeah, I can see the towel you just used to take a shower with. Yeah. It's just an odd time in the world, but yeah, we've all been adapting, so it's been all right.
Yeah. So how are you spreading the word then? I mean, obviously the podcast, but like, how are you getting the word out about this initiative and putting yourself in front of the Capitol, given the lack of human touch, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I think it's just like entrepreneurship would be at any time. It's all based on your network. So there's 4 members of the Transitional Energy team, and we have a combined 71 years of experience in oil and gas, environmental consulting, banking, mining, finance. So we have spent a lot of time at a lot of different companies and known a lot of different people. So that's useful when you're starting a company, because you call people up and say, hey, I got this cool company that I'm working on. Do you know anybody who would be interested? And then that call leads to another call, call, right? So, the basic mechanism for raising capital for a company, I think, is the same. It's just your meetings are on your laptop at home instead of at a boardroom in whatever city.
Well, I like that it's the traditional touches are still working one way or the other. I mean, the Zoom portion is unfortunate because, you kind of lose the enthusiasm, but you got to see people get excited, and then they're just able to be stoic on Zoom, and you're like, good Lord.
Yeah, we had a couple of pitches where we had to wear masks because it was in person, and that's even more difficult, right? Because it's hard to have much expression when you're just looking. Anyway, so yes,
really good eyebrows. How did your team actually form? You said someone had an idea. They had, I forget what you were telling me, X amount of experience, but like, how did you actually start finding the right people? Because sometimes you start teams and you realize like 2 weeks in, you're like, oh, this is not going to work. So how did y'all start picking the expertise to actually get this off the ground?
Yeah, so the 2 co-founders are an engineer and geologist. And so they were thinking about, Selena Derricksweiler is the CEO, and the COO is still got a full-time job, so I won't out that individual, but hopefully not for soon because we're going to get funded. So those 2 folks were really interested in starting a company. Like I said, the waste streams of profit streams idea. And then what they were really lacking is they needed, the financial experience and the power marketing experience, and also the understanding of the regulatory landscape, because believe it or not, it takes longer to permit a geothermal well than it does an oil and gas well in most places. So understanding the regulatory framework and that piece of it was really important. So I joined the team as kind of bringing my engineering and reservoir expertise, as well as understanding regulatory environments, particularly when it comes to Colorado, but also across the U.S. And then Kimberly joined us, Kimberly Eckert. She joined us for many years experience at Deutsche Bank, and also doing some mining finance. And she did some power marketing also. So kind of bringing all of those expertise together has really been helpful. We also have an advisory board that includes some folks from the National Renewable Energy Lab that are focused specifically on geothermal, because we understand, though we know how to produce hot water out of the ground, so we also need to understand the geothermal side. So, and we have some entrepreneurs on our advisory board. So yeah, luckily we've been getting along, you never really know.
I love it. Exactly. No, I mean, it's such a process. A lot of people tend to think, well, I'll just start it with my buddy here. And then you kind of realize we're better friends, not coworkers. So what has y'all's brainstorming sessions been like? You had this one idea, but you really had to, as I say, an idea means nothing. You have to put energy behind it. You have to turn it into something. So how are you building your business plan? What were some of the non-negotiables you kind of realized as you went along the way? What were people asking you as you were putting this company together that ultimately helped shape you guys?
Yeah, we've certainly tweaked things as we've moved along. I think helping convey what is risky and what is not, because there are certain subset investors that are like, well, I want zero risk. And you have to say, well, there's not zero risk, but what we're doing is pretty pretty damn low risk compared to a lot of investments you could make, right? Everybody needs power. So it's pretty easy to talk about the market opportunity. We all need power. Our lights are all on, right? And so trying to convey an investment opportunity that doesn't sound risky, I think was something we learned along the way. I think, finding the right investor fit has been important. And we've spent a lot of time, just hashing that out because transitional is, it's not an existing market. There's not really an existing market that has been utilized for this type of technology, at least successfully. So, just learning how to talk about that in simple terms. And then kind of like I said, you take oil and gas is not easy to understand for everyone. And so how do you break down reservoir characteristics to a guy who lives in Silicon Valley and has only ever programmed before? So, how do you explain that as simply as possible? We've been learning how to do that.
That's interesting. So were you ever an entrepreneur in one way or the other before you jumped into this one? Because this is big. This is definitely an idea that can, as you said, it's not an existing real market yet. I mean, you are really defining it. So where did this entrepreneurial spirit come from?
Great question. No, I've always wanted to start a company. I never knew exactly what I wanted to do, but I remember talking to my husband probably 5 or 6 years ago, and I was like, you know what? I should invest in geothermal leasing. Like, I should just know where the hot water is coming out of the ground in Nevada and lease people up. And then someday it'll be developed. It's much like mineral leasing, right? I was like, you could do the same thing for geothermal leasing. So honestly, looking back, I've always kind of thought about doing geothermal energy. And then when this opportunity, and to be honest, 2020 is not a great time to be looking for a job in oil and gas, right? So when there was an opportunity to make a pivot to use my skills in an industry that I think is only going to grow, it was kind of a no-brainer to go after.
That's awesome. So you think the transition between oil and gas to geothermal, having the discussions we have had, you're right, it does seem like a no-brainer, but some people are still holding tight to oil and gas right now when the market is expected to continue to consolidate for at least the next 2 years. So you think the geothermal space is going to be a good pivot for those potential individuals?
I think there's a lot of people are really hoping for that. I really hope for that, but I don't think there's going to be enough growth in geothermal to absorb the amount of job losses that have happened in oil and gas. Yeah. And I truly hope oil and gas comes back. I think it will. I think it'll just take time. I still love oil and gas.
Not to the scale.
Sorry, what'd you say?
Not to the scale. It's gonna have some sort of long-term impact. We're not gonna see these 500 head companies anymore. I think it's going to stay either the majors or just the small guys, and only be a few of the small guys, honestly.
Yeah, I would say that's a fair prediction. I think that makes sense. I've seen lots of articles recently, Bloomberg and Financial Times, saying the exact same thing. So I do think there is an urge, and people want renewable energy, right? People are paying extra on their bills because they want their electrons to come from a wind power farm out of Wyoming instead of a natural gas plant that's way closer, right? So there's a need for it. The customers want it. So I think it's figuring out how we can rapidly deploy geothermal energy to solve that problem. And I think oil and gas folks have 90% of the skills that they need in order to transition it. But I don't know, there's a geothermal entrepreneurship organization out of UT Austin. Jamie Beard is running it, I believe. And she put on a Pivot 2020 conference at the end of, it was in July, it was the 1st of July. We were a panelist on it. Selena was a panelist on it. I think you can look it up on YouTube, but her whole thing was how do we transition oil and gas workers into geothermal, and how can we get a bunch of entrepreneurs to start a bunch of companies to get geothermal, out there and get oil and gas workers back to work. And I think it is a great idea, and I hope it works, but I think I was looking today, they released, it was an infographic that showed how many people are employed by each renewable energy group. And there's only 9,000 geothermal employees in the United States. And and oil and gas is laying off 10,000 a week or something, right? So there's just not a market big enough to absorb all the oil and gas expertise. I hope it grows quickly, but I mean, realistically, I don't think it can take on all oil and gas workers.
That's a fair prediction, but at least the skill set is there. And if it could in some capacity, that would be awesome. So I am curious, just kind of going back to that though, the idea of we need to start all of these companies and all be entrepreneurs. Not everyone is an entrepreneur. Some people are good with their 9 to 5, so to speak. But that kind of leads me back to the difference between, you got to have grit. You got to be able to find your angel investors, your seed investors, second, third round, just on and on and on. You always have to be on. You always have to be selling. So when you guys started that process, what was your experience with the initial investment and then moving into seed or second round or whatever you want to call it? How did y'all navigate that being new entrepreneurs?
Yeah, so I would say the two co-founders of the company, this is their second go around at a startup. They weren't the founders of the previous startup, but they were like second or third employees, right? So they've been through this cycle before. It takes grit. You get told no a lot, or that's nice, but no, thank you. And so I think you just got to learn that like, not everybody's going to like you, and that's fine, but there's always someone else to talk to that. And I think if you truly feel excited about what you're doing, the drive for that, is really what keeps you going, right? I'm really excited about the opportunity space. And I think if you just keep focusing on that and realizing that, you're going to get the crap kicked out of you occasionally, but that's just part of life. And if 2020 has taught you nothing, right, we're just going to roll with the punches here and we're going to get through this and it's going to be awesome at the end of the day.
That's so cool. So let's say in 5 years, this new space that is transitional energy, not alternative, not traditional, transitional energy. Where do y'all predict this growth? How are y'all scaling? How do you think it's going to impact the other slices of the pie?
Yeah, so, our goal at Transitional Energy is truly to be a power producer. So we plan to own, multiple oil and gas assets, kind of well fields, and we'll be creating electrons and selling it to the grid. We want to be a power producer, a long-term power producer. There might be an opportunity to, sell to Excel Energy or sell to a BP or something, never say never. We're open to everything, but we want this to be a sustainable electrical producer for the grid and utilizing existing resources.
Well, electricity is definitely a game changer for every country out there, for women and education, for opportunities. You can't do your homework in the dark, so to speak. So everything that you guys have been building to create this market that is transitional energy, this reduce, reuse, recycle idea of the oil field, while still supporting the oil field, I think is absolutely killer. So I cannot wait to see where you guys go. I know we're coming to the end here, but tell me a book, podcast, or other resource that has been beneficial to you that you would encourage someone else in oil and energy to partake in.
Yeah. So one of our early conversations with an investor, he suggested this book called Lean Startup. And so being new to starting up companies, I was like, what is this thing? And it was a really good, it went through a lot of companies and how they started and how getting as quickly as possible to failure or success is important. So that was interesting because if you come from an operator standpoint, that's not necessarily your goal. Yeah. But as an entrepreneur, it is. So that was really interesting. And then speaking of podcasts, I've been listening to this podcast for years. It's called Secrets of Wealthy Women from the Wall Street Journal. And it just profiles a bunch of female entrepreneurs that have started companies across all sorts of industries. And there's always something really interesting or a nugget you can get out of it. And when you talk about grit, man, all those women have a ton of grit. And it's just like, there's no giving up. And so that's what you learn from that. But yeah, I really enjoy that podcast, as I do yours. I really like your podcast. Thank you. So yeah, those are a few I can suggest.
That's so cool. Well, Johanna, this conversation has been so uplifting. As I said in the beginning, I have been calling for Mavericks. I've been saying that, the old ways are no longer an option. We need thought leadership. And I think you and your team are bringing that to the oil patch. And that is why I'm so excited for people to hear this episode, because it should encourage people to say, you know what? This seems small, but there is a huge opportunity here. So thank you so much for creating Transitional Energy and the space that is Transitional Energy. I can't wait to see what you guys do. And, if you got any tips and tricks along the way, I encourage you to tell everyone.
Will do. Yes. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And I will talk to you soon.
Okay, sounds good.